In the invasion, the U.S. military forces had overcome the enemy unexpectedly quickly, quote, being so successful so fast that an enemy that should have surrendered or been done in escaped and lived to fight another day, end quote. Although this hypothesis seems far-fetched as an explanation of the nature and extent of the ongoing resistance waged against the U.S. occupation forces and their collaborators in Iraq, the term catastrophic success does express the character of the war precisely. We need only bear in mind that the catastrophe affects one set of people, whereas the success accrues to an entirely different set. Moreover, to appreciate the war's success, we must keep in the forefront of our thinking the instrumental rationality of its perpetrators. We must ask, who bears the responsibility for launching and continuing the war? What are these individuals trying to achieve? And have they, in fact, achieved these objectives? Having answered these questions correctly, we shall be obliged to conclude that the war has been a huge success for those who brought it about, however disastrous it has been for many others, especially for the unfortunate people of Iraq. A short list of the war's perpetrators must include the President and his close advisors, the neoconservative intriguers who stirred up and continued to stoke elite and popular opinion in support of the war, the members of Congress who abdicated their exclusive constitutional responsibility to declare war, authorized the President to take the nation to war if he pleased, and then financed the war by a series of enormous appropriations from the Treasury. Certain politically well-placed persons in the munitions, petrochemical, and financial industries, and members of other interest groups who have chosen to support, sometimes for reasons based on religious beliefs, a war that they perceive as promoting Israel's interests or as helping to bring about fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Each of these responsible parties has gained greatly from the war. President Bush sought, above all, to be reelected. In his 2004 campaign, he made no apologies for the war. Indeed, he sought to take credit for launching it and for waging it relentlessly since the invasion. Vice President Cheney also campaigned actively on the same basis. Bush and Cheney's efforts yielded them the prize they sought. In reshuffling his cabinet for a second term, the President retained the belligerent Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, and other key warmongers remained in their top positions at the Pentagon. And other neocon desk warriors, such as Louis Scooter Libby, Cheney's Chief of Staff, and Elliott Abrams, a special assistant to the President at the National Security Council, retained their important offices elsewhere in the government. Continued success for one and all. Even George Slam Dunk Tenet, who resigned as Director of Central Intelligence of his own accord, not because the President held him accountable for the manifest failures of U.S. intelligence efforts during his tenure, later emerged from the darkness to accept the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of what the President described as Tenet's tireless efforts in service to the nation. Members of Congress had no regrets about authorizing Bush to attack Iraq or about continuing to fund the war lavishly. These career politicians crave nothing more than they crave re-election to office. And nearly all the incumbents who sought re-election in 2004 gained this supreme objective. All but one, Tom Daschle, of the 26 incumbent senators who ran, and all but 6 of the 402 incumbent representatives who ran succeeded. Outcomes that imply a re-election rate greater than 98% for incumbents who ran in both houses combined. Backing the war obviously proved entirely compatible with, if not absolutely essential to, the legislators' quest for continued tenure in office. If, as a consequence of their political actions in the service of their personal ambitions, thousands of Iraqi children had to lose their eyesight or their legs or even their lives, well, c'est la guerre. Politics is no place for sissies. While authorizing enormous increases in military spending during the past 7 years, members of Congress have helped themselves to generous servings of pork from the defense appropriations bills they have passed. According to Winslow Wheeler of the Center for Defense Information in Washington, D.C., quote, by the time Congress had finished with the fiscal year 2005 appropriations bill for the Defense Department, House and Senate members had added more than 2,000 earmarks for home district projects, thereby dishing out to themselves a record-setting $8.9 billion in pork, end quote, to use in buying votes from their constituents. Nor did they stop at that point, because each succeeding year has offered a new opportunity for more of the same. In this workaday plundering of the taxpayers for wholly self-serving reasons, congressional doves as well as hawks, Democrats as well as Republicans, relish the opportunity to act as pork hawks. Between fiscal years 2001 and 2007, national defense outlays, defined narrowly as in the government's official reports, rose by nearly 88%, and that's 50% after official adjustment for inflation. This still continuing upsurge ranks with the great military buildups of the 1960s and 1980s. The beauty of all this increased spending, of course, is that every dollar of it lands in somebody's pocket. Those to whom the pockets belong make a practice of lobbying hard for increased military spending, and they're prepared to compensate in various ways, some legal and some not, the politicians and bureaucrats who steer the money their way. Procurement of goods and services from private contractors has been a major item in the increased military spending of recent years. In fiscal year 2000, the top 10 contractors together received prime contract awards of almost $51 billion. Just 6 years later, in fiscal year 2006, they got nearly $108 billion. An increase of 113%, or about 70% even after generous adjustment for inflation. A useful gauge of how greatly the run-up in the volume of military contracting enriched the owners of these companies, who include, by the way, many members of Congress, is the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's Defense Sector Index. This measure tracks the stock prices of 16 leading aerospace and defense companies, including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Raytheon, which are the biggest boys on this block nowadays. At the time of the U.S. attack on Iraq in March 2003, this index began to rise steadily, and it continued to rise with only brief and slight setbacks until the general market downturn late last year, by which time it had increased by approximately 185%. During the same period, the Dow Jones Industrials and Standard & Poor's 500 indexes had advanced less than half that much, and the NASDAQ Composite Index only about 2/3 as much. In short, the past 5 years have brought a bonanza to the merchants of death. Lest anyone think that an aspiring smaller fellow cannot play in this major league, let Halliburton serve as an inspiring counterexample.